Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The war had been going on long enough that everyone had stopped calling it a war. Officially, it was a multi-species stabilization initiative, a phrase so diplomatically gutted of meaning that it had quietly become the ground unit's favorite joke, particularly among the medics, who approached language the way they approached wounds, with the understanding that what a thing was called and what a thing actually was rarely agreed with each other. Corporal Eli Voss had been making that joke for 8 months, which was how long he had been attached to the 7th Coalition Forward Unit, and it had not gotten less funny to him, which was either a sign of resilience or of something a regimental psychologist would want to discuss at length. He was 31 years old, lean the way field rations and sustained adrenaline make a person lean, with hands that had learned steadiness as a survival skill rather than a natural gift. In his breast pocket, he kept a small notebook. Not for casualty logs, those were digital, managed by a system that was extremely efficient and almost entirely indifferent to the humans it was cataloging. The notebook was for words. He collected them from the other species in the coalition, the way certain people collect stones from places they've been. Not for any practical purpose, but because holding them felt like holding something true. He had Keth words in there, and 3 Dravari phrases that had no standard equivalent, and taking up an increasing number of pages toward the back, Vahari. He had begun learning Vahari the way you begin most things you don't intend to begin. Gradually, and then with embarrassing commitment. The Vahari Expeditionary Force had attached Commander Sarai to his unit 6 months ago, which the Coalition's administrative system had found briefly delightful, and she had found philosophically suspicious, owing to the fact that his surname and hers, rendered in standard transliteration, were identical. Voss and Voss. The paperwork had required a clarifying notation. She had made clear, in the precise and faintly architectural standard she spoke, that coincidences of this kind were the universe being careless, and that she did not respect carelessness in any of its forms. She stood at approximately the height of a tall human woman, and from any distance greater than 10 meters that was almost precisely what she appeared to be. It was the details that told a different story, accumulating quietly the way the most important things tend to. The bioluminescent tracing along her jaw and collarbone, barely visible in daylight, but in low light resembling something between circuitry and cartography. Her eyes, which were unbroken amber from edge to edge without any white, giving her attention a quality that newer unit members found unsettling, until they understood that it was simply what focus looked like on a Vahari face, total, and without apology. Her fingers were longer than a human's by one joint, which lent her gestures an unintentional elegance she would have dismissed as an irrelevant biological observation, if anyone had been unwise enough to raise it. Her hair was dark and moved with a faint independence in still air, not dramatically. She was not a person who did anything dramatically unless she had decided to, but enough that Eli had spent the entirety of one tactical briefing attempting to determine whether it responded to her emotional state, and had arrived at no firm conclusion except that he had retained very little of the briefing. He was aware that this was not an ideal quality in a forward medic. He was also aware, with the reliable self-deception of an otherwise intelligent person, that what he felt when Commander Sarai corrected his Vahari pronunciation, patiently, precisely, with the tone she used for things that were worth fixing, was purely professional admiration. She was an exceptional officer. She made decisions the way good surgical work gets done, without flourish, without hesitation, always along exactly the correct line. He admired that. He respected that. He had also, 4 months ago, discovered that Vahari was not a language structurally suited to puns, and had chosen to make terrible ones in it anyway, specifically because the expression she made when they landed was the closest thing to surprised delight he had ever seen occupy her face. And he was, when it came down to it, not a complicated man about the things he cared about. None of it was relevant, he had decided, until the war was over. The war, as it turned out, had not been consulted on this timeline. The defensive line had been holding for 6 days, which in the honest vocabulary of this particular campaign meant it had been dying slowly for 6 days rather than quickly. Eli knew the difference by now. A line that holds loudly, with counteroffensives and the full theatrical machinery of active engagement, is a line that still believes in itself. A line that holds quietly, eroding in supply delays and communications blackouts and officers deploying words like repositioning instead of retreating. That is a line that has already arrived at its conclusion and is simply waiting for the situation to catch up with the paperwork. By the evening of the 6th day, the 7th Coalition Forward Unit was firmly in the second category, and Eli's triage station had quietly evolved from a forward medical post into the most functional thing left inside a perimeter that was becoming, in real time, a historical footnote. He worked by the light of a chemical lamp and a portable bioscan unit that was 3 software updates behind schedule. The manufacturer's support line had, when queried by the unit's logistics officer, provided a response that managed to be both technically thorough and completely useless, which Eli had torn from the printer and added to the small collection of absurdities he kept folded in his jacket pocket alongside his notebook, because the war had taught him that humor was a resource and you stockpiled what you could. The scanner could identify species with full confidence. Organ placement within those species it approached with what Eli had come to think of as creative optimism. He had compensated with cross-referenced field manuals, 6 months of accumulated improvisational experience, and an informal arrangement with the unit's Keth field surgeon, practitioner Oval, who communicated exclusively through a translation module with a vocabulary gap in the area of urgency, and who had once described a critical bleed as a suboptimal fluid situation, which had briefly become unit terminology before Eli banned it on the grounds that some euphemisms were actively dangerous. There were 11 patients in various states of stability when the eastern position took a direct strike. The sound arrived after the light, the way it always did, that fraction of delay that the brain never fully accepts regardless of how many times it experiences it. 3 soldiers moved from active to critical before the debris from the strike had finished deciding where to land. Eli was already moving. 6 months of forward deployment had restructured his relationship with his own reflexes to the point where the decision to move and the movement itself had stopped consulting each other, which was either an impressive adaptation or something to mention to a psychologist, depending on who was asking. He had the first of the new casualties stabilized and tagged by the time the secondary smoke had begun its slow vertical migration, and was working through the second when his scanner produced a sound he had not programmed it to make and which he recognized anyway, because the human brain is extraordinarily good at identifying sounds. It has decided matter. It was the flag tone for a Vahari biosignature, elevated distress indicators, the particular cluster of readings the system had been configured to treat as serious before asking clarifying questions. He knew the biosignature the way you know a voice, not by its label, but by something that precedes identification entirely. He said something to Corporal Wren, his assistant, that was brief and probably not entirely within the parameters of the unit's communication standards, and moved toward the signal with his kit and the specific quality of conviction that is not optimism and is not confidence, but is what fills the space between them when the alternative is unacceptable. She was behind what had been a section of coalition barrier plating, and was now a more conceptual arrangement of metal, its structural integrity having parted ways with the situation approximately 4 minutes prior. Commander Sarai was sitting with her back against it, one hand pressed to her side with the practiced stillness of someone who has assessed their own damage and elected to present the summary rather than the full report. The shrapnel was Vahari alloy, fragments from the barrier itself, which Eli's mind flagged as cosmically unjust in a way he fully intended to be darkly funny about later, contingent on there being a later. Her field jacket was open. Vahari blood, which the training materials had described as green, and which was in fact a darker and more specific color than that simple word managed to convey, had mixed with the mud beneath her, in a way the training materials had not covered, because training materials were written by people who believed preparation and reality would eventually reach an agreement. Her amber eyes tracked him as he came around the debris. The luminescent trace at her jaw was faint in the smoke-filtered light. She was doing the thing she always did when a situation was worse than she intended to disclose. She was being extremely composed about it, which was both admirable and, from a medical standpoint, a complication. "Your timing," she said in standard, which told him more than the biosigns had, "is acceptable." He was already running the scanner. "High praise," he said. "I'll have it engraved." He opened his kit and got to work, talking to her in the low, continuous way he talked to all his patients. Not because any protocol required it, but because silence during treatment felt like conceding something he wasn't prepared to concede. The weapon's fire overhead had not paused to acknowledge any of this. It rarely did. The battle was a fact about the world they were inside of, like weather, like gravity, and Eli had long since stopped arguing with facts and started working around them. What he had not yet accounted for was that the next few minutes were going to reach back 6 months and reclassify everything that had happened in them into a different kind of story than the one he had believed he was living. He had the bleeding managed and was working on the deeper fragment, the one the scanner flagged with the small amber indicator that meant survivable but not ignored. The scanner's way of expressing concern without committing to an emotion when she moved. Not the restless repositioning of someone in pain, not the involuntary flinch of someone losing the argument with their own nervous system. She moved toward him, deliberately, with the full intentionality that was her most recognizable quality in any context, tactical or otherwise. Her uninjured hand found his forearm and closed around it, and the grip had enough strength in it to be a sentence before any words arrived. He looked up from the wound. She spoke in Vahari. He heard it clearly, which was its own small miracle given that 30 meters to the east the world was conducting a loud and unresolved disagreement with itself, using ordnance that had no interest in the outcome of conversations at ground level. The translator module in his ear processed the construction with the half-second delay it reserved for phrases that defeated its confidence thresholds, the pause that meant, "This is what the words say, but the words are not carrying this alone." Then it delivered its output carefully, like a person handing over something fragile. "If we die here, know that you were my chosen bond partner, and I regret only that I never said so when we had time." Eli Voss had, over the course of his career, maintained composure in a remarkable variety of situations. He had maintained it through a 4-hour field surgery conducted under intermittent fire, with a scanner that kept suggesting the patient's liver was located in a position that contradicted every anatomical reference he owned. He had maintained it when a Keth patient, possessing no cultural framework for the concept of personal space, had breathed directly and enthusiastically into his face for 20 solid minutes while he treated a compound fracture. He had maintained it, famously within the unit, during the incident involving the malfunctioning medical drone that had become briefly and misguidedly convinced it outranked everyone present, and had begun issuing evacuation orders in a tone of profound administrative authority. He did not entirely maintain it now. His hand stopped. 2 seconds, perhaps 3, long enough for the scanner to produce a single quiet beep of professional disapproval, long enough for the battle overhead to demonstrate its complete indifference to the situation at ground level, long enough for something that had been existing in the peripheral vision of his interior life for 6 months to move, without permission, to the center of it. Bond partner was what the translator had offered, and Eli knew enough Vahari by now to understand precisely why it had hesitated. The word she had used, he was reconstructing it, turning it over in the part of his mind that collected words the way other people collected evidence, was not a word for partnership in any casual or provisional sense. It had infrastructure behind it. It implied selection, which in Vihari cultural grammar was not a spontaneous act but a considered one, arrived at through a process the language had 17 words for, and standard had approximately none. It implied declaration, which carried obligations the translator could gesture toward but not fully map. It was, in short, not a word deployed lightly. It was a word you arrived at after thinking about it at length, and said only when you had determined that continued silence was a worse outcome than whatever followed the saying. She had been thinking about it for 6 months. His hands resumed. They did this without a conscious instruction, which was the thing about trained hands. They know their job and they return to it. And in this case, he was grateful because the fragment was still there. And she was still bleeding at a rate the scanner was tracking with the quiet persistence of a system that believes in accuracy even when accuracy is inconvenient. Keeping her alive had become, in the last 30 seconds, a matter of renewed and specific urgency, which was a thought he did not examine too closely, because there was a fragment to remove, and he needed the part of his brain that was currently processing several things simultaneously to maintain some sense of departmental organization. She was watching him work. The luminescent trace at her jaw was doing something he had not observed in 6 months of close and entirely professional attention. A rapid, irregular flicker that his accumulated and informal study of Vihari physiological expression suggested was not a resting state phenomenon. She had said the words. She was now doing what she always did after an irreversible decision. She was waiting, with the absolute stillness of someone who has committed to a position and will not revise it, for the consequences to present themselves. The fragment came free cleanly. He sealed the wound with the economy of someone whose hands have their own memory for this work, and then he looked at her, not at the wound, not at the scanner, not at the tactical situation making its ongoing structural complaints overhead, directly at her, and he said, in Vihari, in the accent that she had been correcting for 6 months, and that was still not quite right, and that she had never once suggested he stop attempting 2 things. The first, we are not dying here. He let that sit for the half-second it needed, and then he said the second thing, reaching for the Vihari construction with the care of someone who knows they are working near the edge of their vocabulary and cannot afford an error in this particular sentence. When we are somewhere that is not this, and here he gestured, very briefly, at the general situation, the smoke and the debris and the ordnance and the mud, encompassing it all with an economy his hands had borrowed from his medical work. You will say that again, slowly, and I will answer it correctly, because I have also been holding words. He had meant to stop there. He was not entirely sure what made him add the last part, except that it was true and the situation had apparently suspended his better editorial instincts. The last part was a Vihari phrase from the back pages of his notebook, one he had written down 4 months ago and looked up specifically and circled. The way you circle things you intend to use when the right moment arrives and stops making excuses. The trace at her jaw shifted, not the rapid flicker of before, something steadier, something that held. She did not speak immediately. Outside their small arrangement of cover and debris and chemical lamplight, the battle continued to be entirely uninterested in them, which was, Eli reflected, the most they could ask of it. Your grammar, she said, finally, in a tone that was almost entirely composed, was adequate. He looked back at the scanner. I'll take adequate, he said. From you, that's a standing ovation. They made the extraction with 4 minutes to spare, which the tactical system logged as within acceptable parameters, and which Eli logged privately as a small and specific miracle that had not consulted the probability estimates before deciding to occur. The evacuation shuttle was loud in the way that machines are loud when they are working harder than they were designed to, and it smelled of hydraulic fluid and the particular quality of relief that 12 people produce when they have all, in the past 2 hours, revised their survival calculations and found the revisions unexpectedly favorable. Sarai was on a field stretcher secured to the shuttle's port wall, stable, her side sealed with a compression bandage that Eli had applied with more care than the tactical situation had technically required, a fact she had not commented on, which meant she had noticed it. He sat across from her in the narrow bay with his kit between his boots and did not attempt conversation, because the shuttle noise made words an investment with uncertain returns, and because some things, once begun, are owed better acoustics than a retreating evacuation craft running its engines at a volume that suggested they, too, were aware of how close it had been. Relay Station, Orvith received them with the organized urgency of a facility that had long since made peace with receiving people in worse condition than they had left. The medical intake system, a unit newer and more confident than Eli's field scanner, with all its software updates intact and an opinion about everything, processed Sarai's biosigns with the brisk efficiency of something that had not spent 6 months learning the difference between what the readings said and what they meant. Eli gave the handoff report himself. It was clinically complete. It contained everything a receiving team needed and nothing that wasn't their business, which was a distinction he felt qualified to make on the grounds that he had been the one in the mud. He was told to rest. He acknowledged the suggestion with the expression of a man who has heard a reasonable thing at an unreasonable time, found a corner of the recovery ward with 2 chairs and a viewport that looked out at the station's exterior plating and the stars beyond it, and he sat in one of the chairs, and he waited. He was not entirely sure she would come. That was the honest version of the next 3 hours, the one he kept below the version where he was simply resting as instructed. She had said what she said under conditions that the human psychological literature, and he suspected, the Vahari equivalent would classify as extreme duress, in a moment when death had shifted from theoretical to probable, and the usual reasons for not saying things had lost their jurisdiction. People said things under those conditions that were true. He believed that. He also knew that true things said in the worst moments sometimes looked different in the ordinary light of survival, and that the distance between what you meant at the edge of an overrun position and what you were prepared to mean inside a functioning station, with regulations and species protocol, and the full resumed weight of normal consequence, was a distance that occasionally surprised people. He opened his notebook to the back pages. The word was still there, circled, in his handwriting which she had described as orthographically troubled on the one occasion he had shown her his Vahari notes, a comment delivered with such precise neutrality that it had taken him a full minute to identify it as affectionate. She found him 3 hours later. He heard her before he saw her, the specific cadence of someone moving with deliberate care, managing what their body would prefer to express more dramatically and declining to give it the satisfaction. She came around the corner of the ward partition and looked at the 2 chairs with the expression she reserved for situations she suspected had been arranged, and correctly concluded that this one had been. She sat. Outside the viewport, the stars maintained their position on the matter with the consistency Eli had always found either comforting or aggravating depending on his proximity to disaster. "You waited," she said. Statement, not question. She had always been precise about the difference. "I had nowhere urgent to be," he said. "My next scheduled argument with the medical supply system isn't until morning." She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when something had landed and she was deciding what to do with it. Then, "You said, when we were somewhere quieter, I would repeat what I said. I did say that. This is not significantly quieter." He listened to the station's ambient register, the infrastructure hum, the PA system cycling through its 4 coalition languages with the weary thoroughness of a system that had given up expecting anyone to listen, the distant sound of someone conducting a grievance with a vending unit 2 corridors away, in a tone that suggested the vending unit was losing. It's quieter than active shrapnel, he offered. Relatively. Relatively, she agreed, and something moved in her voice that was not quite humor but was in the same district. She turned to look at him with those unbroken amber eyes, and the bioluminescent trace at her jaw was steady, the way it was when she had arrived at a decision and closed the file on reconsidering it. Bond partner, she said in Vihari slowly as he had asked. You should understand the word properly. In our grammar it is a declaration and a question at the same time. It does not mean only, I have chosen. It means also, have you. Eli reached into his breast pocket and took out the notebook. He opened it to the back, to the circled word, and held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment without taking it. The trace at her jaw flickered once, in the way he now knew was not a resting state phenomenon and had not been one for longer than he had understood. Your orthography, she said, remains troubled. But the word, he said. She looked at it again. Something at the corners of her eyes changed in the way he had spent 4 months learning to read correctly, and 2 months being certain he was reading correctly, and several weeks understanding that he had been right from the beginning. The word, she said, is right. He took the notebook back and closed it. He had intended to leave it there. The word, the moment, the thing that had been building across 6 months of shared tactical briefings and extraction operations and arguments about medical protocol and terrible puns in a language not designed to survive them. He had intended to let it stand. He was Eli Voss, however, and there were limits to what he could let stand without comment, and he had made his peace with that quality in himself sometime during the 3rd month, when he had caught her almost smiling at a particularly catastrophic Vihari tonal error, and understood that it was not, in fact, a flaw she was interested in him correcting. So he said in Vihari, with the accent that was better than it had been and would keep getting better, a pun so thoroughly embedded in the tonal architecture of the Bond declaration word that it required the standard 2 seconds to fully arrive. A pun that suggested, approximately, that since they were now formally in agreement on the matter, he supposed he would have to stop addressing her as commander during their medical supply arguments, as it seemed statistically unlikely that their future arguments would be conducted along strictly professional lines, and he had always believed in accuracy. She processed it. He watched the moment it landed, the slight shift, the thing at the corners of her eyes that he had a word for now, in her own language, a word he had looked up 4 months ago and written in his notebook and carried since then in the same pocket as everything else that mattered. Your puns, she said, in the tone of someone delivering a verdict they have spent considerable time reaching, are a form of warfare for which the coalition has no established protocol. I've been filing the paperwork, he said. It's a slow process. She looked back out at the stars, which continued to exist with their customary indifference to the events being conducted among them. But she did not look away from the viewport before she said, quietly, and with the precision she brought to everything that was true, I chose well. Eli Voss, who had spent 8 months in a war that wasn't called a war, who had learned another species' language one terrible pun at a time, who had kept a notebook full of words because he had understood, before he had the vocabulary to say it, that some things are worth carrying, looked at the stars alongside her and said, in Vihari, with the orthography she had called troubled and the accent she had never once told him to stop attempting. Yes, we did.